Hi, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable that is unpacking many issues pertaining to AI, digital sovereignty, information integrity, security. We are so pleased to have this group of individuals in the room. Many of you have been handpicked for your contribution and your ability to be able to exchange in the conversations that we are hoping to hold over the next 90 minutes. I want to welcome our online audience, and I'm hoping that you can hear me and the volume is sufficient. So if not, please put up your hand and we'll try to adjust. But we are really pleased to have our online audience as well, including our supporting partner in this initiative, the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Canada Foundation, an organization that is very much engaged in topics that directly impact participatory democracy, topics of security, and bilateral relationships between Canada and the Atlantic, and in particular Germany. So I will be handing the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Bernd Althusman, shortly, but a brief introduction of who I am. My name is Melanie Walker, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian International Council. And I think that if I'm correct, about half of you are not members of our organization. So to give you a little bit of background and hopefully to encourage you to check us out online, we are a coast-to-coast organization that exists to engage and inform Canadians on international affairs, to be aware of the world around us, and to help discuss topics just like this, the role that we want to have in the world. We talk about issues such as security, issues such as AI, certainly talking about our relationships with countries across the globe, including the US, our friends to the south. And we've had many dialogues in recent months focusing on defense and how we want to be engaging internationally when it comes to our allies, our partners, the donors that we want to be working with when it comes to business development and trade, how we want to be structuring our engagement with the rest of the world. We have more than 20 branches across the country, so we truly are a coast-to-coast organization, and together we organize more than 200 events per year. We are a volunteer-led organization, and our Toronto branch president, Mustafa Ryan, is right here. So if you do want to talk about membership, please go talk to him. We also have our board member here, co-chair, sorry, Mila, to put the spotlight on you, but we're delighted to have you here. And I'm going to pass the floor over because we have a very packed agenda, and we do really want to facilitate conversation and dialogue. So I'm hoping that my colleague Bernd is online, and I will pass the baton over to him to say a few words before we get started with our first speakers, but he might not be online. So what I might do is pass it over to you, Alex, to introduce our speakers, and if our colleague joins us, we'll pass it over to him.
Sounds good. We can circle back after the fact. But yes, thank you everybody for coming. I invited a lot of you personally, so I appreciate you making the time to come, especially at a complicated time, such as 5:30, making it around Toronto. Probably sprinted here, and I appreciate it. Beats the sweat on my head as well. But yeah, welcome. We're having almost the first of its kind roundtable when it comes to topics involving AI in Canada to this level. We have in this room sitting private industries as well as government. And just through the discussions that we're going to curate today, to go around, discuss with our fantastic speakers that we have, we're going to really get into what's happening in Canada. A lot is going on. We have an update with this digital policy in Canada has been unprecedented. And the Carney government with the AI for All strategy, well, a lot is happening. Let's unpack it. A little bit of context. Canada, we're one of the first countries to release actually an AI strategy back in 2017. We led the charge, but fortunately things fell off. The Carney government, these updates, there's a lot of potential for Canada. There's also a lot of things that we can get wrong. There's a lot of things that we can learn from other people. And through that, we need to have these discussions, hard discussions, where we potentially disagree to get consensus, to make Canada great again, to use South of the reference. But enough of me, enough of introductions. I have two, again, fantastic speakers that can really get into these topics. I'll start first with the left of me, my actual former boss, Helen Hayes. Helen, she's an academic, policy leader, and researcher working on the intersection of digital technology, democracy, and public life. She's a Mila AI Policy Fellow and a Dialogue Fellow at the Morris J. Ross Center for Dialogue at Fraser University. Named to 2026 Forbes 30 Under 30 in the education section of that. She was a recipient and also won the Peaks Emerging Leader Award. Peabody Award nominee for executive producing Left to Their Own Devices, podcast for young people, experiences and their experiences with digital technologies. She's a leader in the space, and Helen, we're really excited to have you today. To the left of Helen, we have Jaxson. Jaxson is a technology strategist and policy leader with over a decade of experience across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He's the CEO of Aperture AI and senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Previously, senior policy advisor to Canada's Minister of Innovation, Science, and Industry. He played a central role in designing a $2.4 billion AI sovereign compute strategy and passing major reforms to competition. That's a pretty detailed CV on you both. Lost for words, but I'll talk about the rule engagement for this evening and how we're going to go about this. We're going to have two presentations, 20 minutes pop. Then what we're going to have is a little bit of a moderated discussion between us. I'm going to ask about 3 questions before opening up to the floor. There, you can jump in, please introduce yourself, phrase your question, ask it to the speaker, or put out to the round table to discuss further. Without further ado, let's get into it. Thank you so much for being here, everyone.
Sounds good. Awesome. Well, happy to kick it off, and thanks so much for having us. It's gonna be a lot of fun. I'm personally glad to be speaking alongside Helen. Helen is super smart. If you haven't read some of her recent work, highly encourage you doing so, especially a recent op-ed that she wrote, which I think totally nailed our current policy discourse. Helen and I started talking back when I was briefly in government. I did a tour of duty. Didn't know what I was doing. I grew up actually in Toronto's tech ecosystem, and had an old friend reach out and say, "Hey, have you ever thought about getting involved in government public service?" And I said, "Oh, well, never done it full time," but I was given the opportunity, and then suddenly it was sold to me as, "Hey, let's reform our data privacy bills," and then suddenly ChatGPT was released, and then things changed a little bit. So really happy to be here with you now, and that was 4 years ago, so things have changed a little bit since then. We've seen a lot moving. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to throw a lot at you really fast. I hope some of it lands at the very least. If some of it doesn't, if you have questions, I know we've got some time for Q&A after, but if you'll bear with me, there may be a decent amount of text on these slides, but I'm going to try and go through it. Is there a clicker I can use, or I can now?
I think you have Camilla.
Yeah, so if we can go to the next one. So this is a great start, which is an absolutely shameless self-plug to read some of my stuff. It will probably be much more eloquent than anything I will say today, because we wrote it in a 60-page version. It's Sovereign by Design. It's the name of the report. You can find it at sovereignbydesign.ca. I wrote this alongside Sean Mullen, who's a former advisor to the Prime Minister, as well as a senior official in Queen's Park. This really tries to solve a question that we wish, if we were still serving a minister in government, that the resource that we wish that we had, basically, because we did not feel this whole conversation around AI sovereignty, what does that actually really mean? We felt that it was not being answered enough comprehensiveness. And more importantly, it wasn't being presented alongside realistic options that a policymaker would actually take, right? It's one thing to kind of be able to put out a number of ideas in the discourse and criticize the government. It's extremely easy. There's always something to criticize. But we're like, hey, listen, realistically, what's the menu? Like, what can you actually do that's politically feasible that might actually make a dent in our country's AI policy? And so, if you're curious, definitely encourage you to check it out. There's a 60-page version. There's also a 10-page version, and there's also a 1-page version if you don't have a lot of time. Or just ask Claude or whatever to summarize it, and I'm sure it'll be useful. But that's my first self plug. If we can skip that slide. Again, I just mentioned we can just go through and pull up all the text on this. I just want to quickly talk about the rise of AI sovereignty and what this actually means. I'll get to a definition in short, but how did this actually come about? Well, first off, AI sovereignty. The whole idea is, can we, start to have more control over AI? That's the basic idea, right? Can we, just similar to our borders, can we have control over this thing? Because right now, no country really possesses control over the AI stack. It's an incredibly complicated technology stack, right? So if you think about how do we actually get here, 100%, almost 100% of these advanced chips are being manufactured by a single company in Taiwan. It's a process that almost defies the human brain. There's like a quadrillion droplets of water and light particles blasted, and somehow on these like nanometer sized silicon wafers, this has suddenly turned into like the most powerful technology that we've yet seen, right? There's a great Wall Street Journal article. If you ever have time, you're interested, it goes into the machines that make these chips. It's produced by a single company, 100% of these machines in the Netherlands, called ASML. Very, very curious story. I find this fascinating. It's extreme ultraviolet lithography. Again, these machines are crazily complex. They each cost like hundreds of millions of dollars. There's a fight to who even can get those machines. So that's, again, another constraint, right? And so all that is to say is this supply chain is very complex. No country, US, China, no one has a quite hold on the supply chain, because it's also funneled tons of rare earth minerals, critical minerals, lots of different inputs from all around the world are essential to making this even possible. At the same time, the world is also an extremely unstable place right now. Previously known, international order that maybe we thought we had, it's just breaking down. Things seem to be, deals that are struck overnight, and then the deals disappear within the next 24 hours. Super powerful AI models are released on a Wednesday, and then they're not available on a Friday, right? And of course, it goes without saying, a lot of this comes down to a rapid change in the relationship we have with, our closest trading partner and the de facto kind of hegemon we've had for the last half century, which is the United States. I would say Canada is particularly exposed in this context, right? We are so extraordinarily dependent on the United States in so many ways. We're dependent on them for most of the top AI models. We're also dependent on them for the vast majority of our trade. We are also constantly, in a way, being drained by the United States. We've signed up to CUSMA, which has driven a lot of economic value for our country, but it's positioned us in a very certain way, which is we provide raw material, and you can view that as natural resources. You can view that as aluminum and steel, semi-processed goods that eventually, go into, it seems like increasingly American-made cars. And, we ship them across bridges that sometimes we pay for and don't even open, right? We don't have a ton of control, right? And if you think about our AI and technology ecosystem, so many of the core ideas behind AI, deep learning, neural networks, right? Even actually transformers, a lot of this came about from Canadian researchers, whether they were based at our universities or even doing some comments at American tech companies. We don't commercialize these innovations. It's probably like the biggest issue that we face as a country is we've actually generated a lot of the top IP around AI, around quantum, around fusion tech, you name like any top technology in biotech, and Canadians are a part of it, but we don't really see the gains from that. So we're kind of stuck in this position, right? What I want to leave you with on thinking about the geopolitical side is let's just try to avoid the binary trap as a country. We're stuck in two binaries in the context of AI. One is between Silicon Valley and Beijing in terms of the AI models, in terms of the AI stack. And the second is a regulatory binary, which is really stuck between the United States and Brussels. Right? We can go to the next slide. I talked a bit about the dilemma here. How can we start to get ourselves out of the dilemma? Well, our prime minister seems to think he has an idea. I'm going to share this quote with you, a part of it, not because I'm necessarily endorsing it, because it gives you a sense from a rhetorical perspective where he wants to go. He says, we will ultimately not be forced to choose on AI between hegemons, which basically refers to the US and China, and hyperscalers, which refers to companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, and Anthropic. But what do we bring to the table? How are we going to get away from choosing between hegemons and hyperscalers? He's talked about a middle power alliance, right? So can we do that with France, UK, Australia, Japan, India? Perhaps. But again, what do we offer? What do we offer in that context? We also have actually failed to adopt AI. Again, in Canada, we're adopting it much slower than a lot of other countries. Even though we invented a lot of these core technologies, Canadians' trust in AI is among the lowest of any developed country in the world. And this is a real sovereignty risk, right? And so let's just talk about the hard economics of it. Some of the high-end forecasts say this could drive $300 billion to our economy, which would largely offset, a lot of bad scenarios that could happen to us in this trade context and a lot of other areas. Even if we got 50 billion from decent AI adoption, that'd be quite considerable, right? That would replace a key sector of our economy effectively. We have to figure this out. It's not a silver. I don't think AI is a silver bullet, by the way, but it's probably one of the decent, most general purpose levers that exists. We can go to the next slide. But the challenge is that we are, again, I'm going to emphasize this again through actual numbers this time. This is a number I want you to remember, which is 47. Coincidentally coincides with the 47th president of the United States. We are 47th in digital infrastructure as a country. We used to be number 3 in 2010. We are 42 out of 47 in trust, 44 out of 47 in training. We have less than 1% of the compute capacity available in developed countries on a per capita basis. So again, compute, that's what's actually powering these AI servers processes. We don't have a lot of it. We don't have a lot of it in Canada. So we are stuck. If we actually want to make a move on this, there's a lot of work we have to do. I'm going to move quickly to a definition of AI sovereignty so we can actually start talking about more of the specifics, which is on the next slide. We have not, I think, as a country, come to a easy definition on this. The closest we've gotten to is AI sovereignty means being free from coercion. So somebody turns off the taps overnight on a powerful model, we have options. Someone says, oh, you know what, actually, Microsoft is going to pause or throttle some of the services that are available, or Google, or whatever the provider is. We have options. We have backups. We're maybe multi-cloud or multi-model, whatever that means, right? Maybe it's not always the best, the most cutting edge, the latest and greatest, but I hate to use the phrase good enough, but the truth is there are a lot of very good models out there that are actually available for free. Just requires you to kind of put some time, effort, have some infrastructure, some capability to actually customize that for your country. It also should involve us thinking about, well, maybe where do we not want to be dependent, right? Are there national security use cases? Are there super sensitive areas like, let's say, Canadians' health and financial information that, sovereignty, or at least having more control, having options, that is more important for us, right? So again, what we tried to do in this report is not figure out, everything, but we've tried to get to a closer usable definition, which is how do we get to be freer from coercion across multiple areas of the AI stack, which I'm going to go to in a second. And then also think about this in different dimensions. So we can go to the next slide. I'm not going to read everything that's on the slide, but what we tried to break this down is into multiple different layers, right? So I mentioned chips before. There's also cloud services, cloud infrastructure, right? So how does this all happen? You guys have probably seen some of the protests and various things about data centers. A lot of this is housed in massive data centers, which have tons of graphical processing units. That's what's powering a lot of the services. We also have AI models, which are, the models powering systems like ChatGPT, Claude, Cohere. At the very kind of bottom of the stack, we have AI applications. Those might be what you're kind of encountering on the most front-facing kind of consumer side of what you're engaging with. We can go to the next slide. These are different dimensions we thought about to think in the context of digital sovereignty. So you can see the term AI sovereignty itself, or digital sovereignty, I think is doing too much work. So there's different layers, right? So data sovereignty would be, what actual training data sets are involved in this, right? What's been our engagement on the data? If, let's say, we try and train models in Canada, but we're using data from entirely outside of Canada, what does that mean? Does that mean our culture gets diluted? I think there was one study that found that actually French language models, for example, it actually highly diluted the availability or basically the appearance of Quebecois French. And so that would have implications on our culture, let's say, if that was being used. Again, I mentioned physical infrastructure and networks. Sorry, I jumped ahead here. Is that this table? I just had the wrong table on my own phone there. The other one is jurisdictional sovereignty. So can we actually enforce our own rules? There's been some kerfuffle in Canada around, does the US Cloud Act actually apply for US owned infrastructure in Canada? I'm not going to try and answer that question right here, leave it to the lawyers. But again, these are all considerations, right? What jurisdiction is actually enforced in our own country for the services that we use? Another thing I'd bring up would be societal sovereignty. And so lots of discussion, of course, in the last decade plus on social media platforms, which, again, none of the large social media platforms are in Canada. There's some efforts to try and change that. But are we even able to form and shape our own preferences and then express them freely? If lots of our conversation in our own country is being shaped by algorithms that we don't control, if the information that is available is something we don't control, whose agenda is kind of being shaped, whose information sources are available? I'll also say the last kind of angle is economic sovereignty. Sometimes you could call this freedom to operate, but it's even what is the competitive moat around large AI platforms and services? Do Canadian companies, if they try to be in the space, do they even have a chance to do so? Or are there, is there monopolistic behavior? Is there a massive concentration of resources? Do we have that freedom, right? So those are some of the different dimensions that we try and think through. I feel like I've been a little bit negative or critical, so I want to go to flip to the happy side for a second. If we go to the next slide, we have a lot of strengths. I mentioned our research legacy. So we do have a lot of great researchers. We have a lot of great talent in Canada. We also have great assets to build AI infrastructure, right? We have great energy. We have a vibrant domestic tech industry. We also have actually one of the only kind of frontier or frontier adjacent companies in the world that is not based in the US or China. That's Cohere. I believe the most recent valuation for the company is about 20 billion. They recently acquired a smaller German AI lab. They're trying to take a different focus on this, which is really more enterprise applications, critical infrastructure, defense. I think that's probably a smart play. Just trying to speak in a non-biased perspective as possible. Obviously, the government wants this company to stay in Canada. They want it to be a national AI champion. In some ways, the company's kind of split. They're actually just tripling their headcount and size in the UK. Their CEO is actually a dual Canadian British citizen. Their CTO is also over in the UK. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if we wanted to maintain control of a strong AI company, to have it kind of ownership, be a part of, have multiple countries have an ownership stake in a way. We also have, I would say, growing capabilities across a number of different verticals. And so we have good companies, I'd say, in the healthcare space, across knowledge management. We also have telecom companies like Bell and Telus, which have kind of normally been trying to provide cell phone services, also trying to expand into this space. So a lot of change very fast. If we can go to the next slide, I also think there is potentially a market opportunity for us here on this whole sovereign AI concept. What's the reason why? It's well, because, why is, let's say, the example of Chinese models, despite them being often freely available open source, why is there not higher adoption? Well, maybe there's some trust factors there. What is some of the pushback against Claude, and ChatGPT, right? Well, maybe there's a trust factor there, again, from this kind of hegemonic sense. I don't have a firm answer there, but it does seem like the Canadian brand, if you look at any public polling surveys, is pretty darn good. And so maybe that is a big part of, okay, well, what models can be, owned or rented that are maybe Canadian in context? Maybe Cohere is an opportunity there. Maybe other companies are that emerge as well. If we can jump to the next slide. I'm going to jump back to talking about bad stuff or vulnerabilities for a second. Go to the report if you're actually interested in kind of going in deeper on this. But we basically found that our highest vulnerability areas, basically you could call them choke points. I mean, one is chips, which I mentioned is highly concentrated. I don't think we have any meaningful short-term or even medium-term chance of getting away from that dependency. That's what our research found. It is possible that maybe 5 to 10 years from now, we are seeing a lot of investment now into chips and also memory, which has become a huge choke point and constraint in the AI ecosystem. Maybe Canada can play a role in that. We have companies like Thales, for example, which are working on laser etching the actual model details themselves onto the chips, and maybe that increases inference speed, reduces latency by a huge multiple. And so we do have a role there in the next supply chain. But typically, if there's a Canadian hardware company in this space, they've often been acquired early. And, a lot of founders, they won't necessarily say no to a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. So I'm curious. The other area might be quantum. We have a number of kind of globally competitive quantum companies. I could take that tangent for us for a while, but where can we actually have an impact? It's the second choke point on cloud infrastructure. I mentioned energy. I mentioned our ability to potentially build infrastructure here. We have a lot of open land as a country, so that might be something we can solve to reduce our vulnerability over time. I'm going to jump to the next slide. I mentioned sovereign cloud as a strategic priority. There's 3 different ways that could actually happen, and I don't think they're all as large as each other. So one example of how we could move towards having more sovereign cloud. So again, AI infrastructure in Canada that we either have an ownership stake in, or maybe there's more sovereign requirements, let's say, to keep the data in Canada. One would be that we own or host that cloud. It's like fully Canadian owned, fully Canadian operated, like rah Canada as much as possible through that whole stack. Maybe that is possible. Some research has calculated that would have a sovereignty premium attached, let's say 20 to 30%. So basically it's more expensive. It also might maybe not be as secure as something, let's say, hosted by Microsoft or Amazon or Google, given that they have a lot of experience and work doing this at scale. But it is possible, and maybe that makes sense for national security, defense, certain things that are, Canadianized only at the highest level of sensitivity. Another example would be, and we don't take original credit for this, but it's happening in countries like France and Germany, where they have sometimes Microsoft or Google technology that is powering the data center. So it's if you're a developer, you're a builder for the government, a business, you're accessing it just the same. But there is a intermediary, there's a subsidiary on the home front that is basically running it. Maybe that's a different model. A third might be similar to what Australia has done, where they have a hosting certification framework. So they have certain requirements, let's say audit rights for the government, might be security clearance related. And that might help to basically have some additional requirements related to sovereignty, having sovereignty as a lens around technology investments. So that's another area on cloud infrastructure. I'm just going to go to the last next slide for a moment. Actually, you know what? I'm going to skip the slide. Sorry. I'm going to jump through. I know we're probably, sorry, one back. My bad. Perfect. Thanks. Again, I'm going to have time. We're going to have time for questions after. I know we're probably running a bit tight on time, so I want to just circle back here. Competitiveness, actually being competitive on some of these technologies and having competitive options, that's really, I think, what our starting point needs to be as a country. If we are only trying to create rules around this, we're only trying to regulate technology that other people have built, I think that's commentary. And I actually think it's not very effective. We have maybe tried, and I worked on this in the government. We came up with an AI and Data Act, but again, we didn't have an essential role in the supply chain. I think we would have struggled at sometimes to enforce that effectively. I don't think that idea of having AI legislation itself, I don't think it's a bad idea. I think the government's trying that in a number of different ways now, but we need to reduce our dependency and we need to have options. That is one of the ways that we get a more credible and effective enforcement regime. And again, a lot of the things that we do eventually want to have, let's say, in enforcing negative AI behaviors or consequences. Well, those are the same ingredients as competitiveness. So why wouldn't we just go and try and do it? In the same way that, if I was trying to pursue energy security as a country, well, renewables are often just as cost effective, if not sometimes cheaper now. And so why wouldn't you just try and do more of that? Right? Again, it's a viable option for increasingly baseload power. And so I think of AI development, AI competitiveness in the same way. An AI Safety Institute, if we wanted to staff that properly to test and evaluate models, well, that would require government to hire lots of great AI talent. That would make us more competitive as a country. It would also require us to incentivize to develop more talent bases for AI in our country. So again, this is a sequencing issue, I think. How should Canada regulate or govern AI? Well, I think we should start by building capability, building deep capacity, building competitiveness. I think that'll be critical. I know Helen's going to speak a lot about Europe. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to summarize this slide and just say Europe came out with probably the most robust AI legislation in the world. They've sometimes been applauded for that, sometimes been criticized. I would just say that I think they didn't do it at the same time as developing strong capabilities, and now they're having to pivot, right? So there's this seminal report that came out from Mario Draghi, basically said if they don't become more productive, they will be forced to choose. They won't be a leader in new technologies. And so now, I would say if we want to chase to where the puck is going, let's try to build capability and capacity at the same time as we're trying to build governance. Otherwise, we will get stuck, and we will have to maybe overregulate first and not have capacity. We'll be maybe bullied or be overly dependent. That's not where we want to go. I'll just try to end with some more specifics here, if I may. Do I still have time? Okay. Next slide. So I've talked about a few different things. So what I think we could actually do on sovereign compute and cloud, let's execute at scale and actually build, let's say, what would it look like if we had 10% of the global compute capacity in Canada as a moonshot goal? That would be a massive build out, but it might give us a bit of leverage if that data center capacity also existed here. It also might give us a bit more capabilities to actually be useful to allies if we want to have a middle powers type alliance, right? We can store a lot more of that compute. We're much more able to build that compute here than, let's say, in smaller island countries like Japan or Britain. The government is committed in AI for All, their national strategy, to build out a supercomputer as well as a sovereign cloud procurement, which will be part of the government's public services. I think those are good things. Again, they're also a drop in the bucket. We're talking about under $1 billion build-outs in a world where I think we're having 600 billion of US spend on this and 7 trillion by 2030. These are extraordinary numbers, right? So we would have to think about this as a $100 billion play if it was going to be, I think, realistic over the next few years. How could we maybe start to anchor that demand so that there's more incentive for developers and builders? I don't think it's just deregulating and free for all on data center build-outs, but I think it's actually trying to take a responsible approach where you also pool provincial and federal demand, and let's say major regulated industries like telecoms, banks, et cetera, that maybe have a higher premium on data sovereignty, higher importance of it, and that can help to produce offtake agreements that make that more feasible. I talked about AI adoption. The government has set a very, very significant target. So the most recent StatScan survey, we were at 19 or 20% adoption the most recent quarter. They want to triple that to 60% adoption in the next few years. I think that's possible, but I think it also starts with addressing the challenge, which is lots of people are already using AI, and I think it's unmeasured. So we need to measure properly, and then also we need to kind of bring that AI kind of out of the shadows, so to speak, and actually just be honest about it. I think I can say for a fact, lots of people at big companies in Canada and big governments are using AI. They're taking briefing notes home or doing whatever, and they're using it. And so how can we make this a thing that is has guidance around it and people feel comfortable sharing that? I think our numbers would, number one, improve and be more realistic. And two, I think that would help shape the trust conversation. Say, okay, what are the realistic ways people are actually already using it? Let's build on that. Let's share those best practices, and that can help to improve adoption. I mentioned state capacity. I think the AI Safety Institute actually emboldening that is a strong way to do so. We've also talked about a digital super regulators sometimes being talked about with the new bills. I'll maybe leave that for Q&A, but I think we need some improvement on our digital regulatory capacity as a country, because it's basically 25 years old in a lot of ways, if you even think about the privacy commissioner. Last quick thing, talent attraction, retention. Again, I mentioned brain drain. We train some of the best software engineers, data scientists in the world, and public policy and social science folks, and we let a lot of them leave. We don't put very much any money in retention. And so at the same time, we're trying to attract the world's talent. It'd be great if we retain some of the ones that we train. So I have a couple specific ideas around that we can talk about after, but I'll leave it there. I don't want to overspeak. So thank you. Cool.
Super robust. We'll save questions just to the end for Q&A, but Helen, you want to jump in?
Great. Yeah.
Oh, are you ready?
Hey, everyone. I'm Helen. Thanks for the intro, Alec. I'm not a digital sovereignty expert, and I don't claim to be. My work focuses mostly on platform governance, on online harms, and on AI policy. That's what I've been working on for the last 6 years or so. And so today, my talk comes from the perspective of governance and what we can do to balance this conversation between sovereignty and governance, which are often seen as binary objectives, but that I'm going to argue over the next 20 minutes or so actually are probably closer than we might expect them to be. So over the past few years, obviously AI has gone from this niche topic into something that dominates nearly every policy conversation. It's reshaping how we work, how we learn, how governments deliver services, and it's increasingly how countries think about both economic competitiveness and national sovereignty. And as AI has moved into the mainstream, so has the conversation about governing it. Not long ago, this debate came down to a single question: should governments actually regulate AI? That question has now largely disappeared, which by standards of policy debates is astonishingly fast. We're no longer debating about whether governments have a role in regulating AI, but what that role actually should look like. So that sounds like a subtle distinction, but in my view, it actually isn't. Writing legislation is one thing, but building institutions that can actually govern a technology that's moving so rapidly is something else entirely. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Great, so Canada is at a particularly interesting moment in the conversation. We have the AI for All strategy, we have Bill C-34, we have Bill C-36, a newly proposed Digital Safety and Privacy Commission, and running underneath all of that is this growing focus on digital sovereignty. So that's a great deal of institutional change happening at once. And it reflects, I think, a tension that we all feel. We want to foster innovation, we want to strengthen productivity, and we want to remain globally competitive. But at the same time, Canadians are asking these hard questions about safety and transparency and accountability, and of course, trust. So here's the thing, though. Those shouldn't be, and in my view, aren't actually competing objectives. And I think they're actually the same, which is why the key message on this slide matters. Canada is no longer debating whether to govern AI, it's deciding how, and that's turned out to be a much harder question. Before we look at how anyone else has answered that question, it's worth talking about why we think governing AI is so hard. AI governance is not simply about AI. It's about governing change, and it's about governing decisions that impact people. And governing those two things means managing tensions that never really fully resolve. There are tensions of capability, tensions of value, tensions of ownership over data and models and infrastructure, tensions of specificity, and tensions of scale, because AI governance exists both locally and nationally, and also internationally, all at once. And none of these tensions are new. Every transformative technology has forced societies to confront some version of these tensions. But what's new is the pace. AI evolves faster than the policy processes we have traditionally relied on, which means governments are being asked to govern something that may change several times before the regulations governing it are actually fully implemented. And that's the institutional challenge that every democracy is now confronting as they think about this AI question. And here's what that challenge looks like in practice. Any national AI governance system, including ours in Canada, sits inside international systems above it, and provincial, territorial, municipal, and sectoral systems below it. On the one side of this diagram, we have strategy, and on the other, we have policy. And in the middle, kind of holding it all together, are coordinating actors. The question on this slide is the one that I keep coming back to. How should Canada coordinate across all of the actors and initiatives inside that system? And that brings me to Europe, because Europe is the first place that has tried to answer this question at scale and in law. The EU AI Act has received an extraordinary amount of attention. Depending on who you ask, as Jaxson mentioned, it's either the world's most ambitious attempt to govern AI or the beginning of the end of European innovation. But once you move past those binary headlines, the act is, in my view, remarkably pragmatic, and it rests on the three ideas that are on screen. First, a risk-based framework. So obligations increase with the level of risk an AI system poses. Second, shared responsibilities. So providers or the developers carry the primary compliance obligations, while deployers carry operational responsibilities when they use high-risk systems. And third, there are rules for general purpose AI, which are baseline transparency and copyright obligations for all models, with additional testing, risk management, and cybersecurity requirements for models that pose systemic risk. The underlying shift matters, in my view, more than the details of this, though. Rather than trying to regulate AI as a single technology, Europe chose to regulate AI in how it's used and where the consequences of failure are the greatest. So that choice produces the hierarchy that you see here. At the top, we have unacceptable risk. So these are applications that pose clear threats to safety, to livelihood, and potentially to rights. Things like social scoring by governments, certain forms of manipulative AI. These are considered fundamentally incompatible with democratic values, and they're banned. At the bottom, we have minimal risk. These are things like spam filters, like recommendation algorithms. They're the systems that most of us encounter every day. And the Act largely leaves those things alone. In between, however, sits limited risk systems, which mainly carry transparency obligations so that people should know when they're interacting with an AI system. But the real center of gravity here is high-risk systems. This is AI that's used to determine who gets hired, who receives a mortgage, how patients are treated, how policing is conducted, how essential public services are delivered. And that's where Europe concentrated its regulatory effort, because that's where the consequences of getting it wrong stop being technical and start being human. And this is a useful reminder that AI policy is actually about the decisions and institutions that AI increasingly shapes, not just about the tech itself. So the central question, should Canada take Europe's lead? My answer is no, but also yes, both at the same time. No, we shouldn't copy Europe. Canada has different institutions, it has different constitutional arrangements, political traditions, and also a different relationship with technology. So what works in Brussels probably won't map cleanly onto Canadian federalism. But Europe has done something invaluable for the rest of us. It's become the world's first large-scale laboratory for democratic AI governance. And laboratories are useful precisely because they let everyone else learn. So the answer I would offer to this question is the one on this slide. Canada should learn from Europe's implementation, but not necessarily replicate its legislation. And learning in practice means asking better questions. I have 4 of them here. What problems are we actually trying to solve? Which institutions should solve those problems? What should government actually govern? And what should be left to markets, to standards bodies, or to self-regulation? These are deceivingly complex questions, but in my view, they're the right ones to ask. And Canada's advantage is that we no longer have to ask them in the abstract, because we have Europe as a case study to learn from. Here's the first thing that the evidence teaches us. When people hear the phrase AI governance, they usually picture legislation. right? A law is passed, requirements are established, regulators enforce compliance, and then a problem solved. The reality is that it actually looks like this slide. Governance is an ecosystem, and legislation is only one layer of it. It runs from technology itself through infrastructure, models and data, deployment, standards and audits, institutions, and finally to the thing that the entire chain exists to produce, which is public trust. The legislation gets the headlines, but the rest of the ecosystem actually determines whether it succeeds. And to its credit, Europe actually understood this. It didn't just pass a law, it built an architecture around it. The EU AI office that coordinates implementation, it oversees general purpose AI models and promotes consistent enforcement across member states. It has national regulators that enforce the act in each country through supervision and investigation and penalties. There are harmonized standards and codes of practice that translate legal requirements into practical, technical, and organizational guidance. And there's also conformity assessment and market surveillance that monitors those systems after they're deployed to the market. Each of those pieces performs the same essential job by turning broad legal principles into practical governance. So what has Europe gotten right? First, risk-based regulation. Europe resisted the temptation to regulate everything equally and concentrated its effort where potential harms are greatest. I think this is a strength. Second, and this is a lesson that I think receives far less attention, Europe invested in independent governance capacity. So there's a dedicated regulatory institution with the expertise and the authority to oversee AI effectively. Third, there are common standards. The EU has 27 member states, multiple languages, very different administrative and regulatory cultures. So building consistent technical requirements across that diversity is obviously extraordinarily difficult, but it's also extraordinarily valuable because it creates predictability in a world where AI systems cross borders far more easily than laws actually do. Fourth, there's an iterative implementation to the Act. The Act phases in over years and is designed to evolve through delegated acts, through technical standards and codes of practice. That's an acknowledgement, in my view, that today's governance challenges are unlikely to be tomorrow's governance challenges. And I find that one of the most realistic features of this entire framework. And lastly, Europe regulated general purpose AI. It placed transparency, safety, and accountability obligations on the foundation models whose downstream applications will probably reach the furthest. None of this means that the model is without problems, though. Europe is discovering just how difficult that implementation really is, to Jaxson's earlier point. So first, we have regulatory complexity and slow implementation. The Act's multi-layered governance structure and phased rollout have proven slower and more administratively complex than I think many people had anticipated. Then we have the challenge of overlapping frameworks. The AI Act sits alongside the GDPR, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, cybersecurity requirements, the list goes on and on and on. And each serves an important purpose, but together they form this landscape that's actually pretty difficult to navigate. Compliance burdens also usually fall heaviest on small and medium-sized enterprises, for whom documentation and conformity assessment and risk management costs weigh most. And there's obviously this continuing struggle to reassure industry that strong safeguards and a competitive innovation ecosystem can coexist. I raise these challenges because I think those are the challenges that Canada should expect to face as we work through the AI strategy. So if you distill all of these scattershot thoughts into guidance for Canada, it comes down to what I think are three pillars. Canada may want to adopt the same risk-based governance, an independent regulator, standards ecosystem, and continuous guidance that can keep pace as much as possible with the technology. We may want to adapt the general purpose AI obligations, the transparency requirements, and the codes of practice. And we may want to avoid excessive complexity, a one-size-fits-all regulation, and the trap that Europe is wrestling with right now, which is compliance obligations without the institutional capacity to totally oversee them. And this all brings me to what I think is the most important part of my argument, which is where Canada can actually lead. We usually talk about AI competitiveness in terms of sovereignty, in terms of compute, talent, investment, commercialization, and obviously those matter enormously. But I think there's another form of competitiveness that receives far less attention, and it's the first item on this slide: trust in public institutions. Canada consistently ranks among countries with strong public institutions, like independent regulators, respected public service, internationally recognized standards organizations. We take those assets for granted because they don't feel technological. In the age of AI, they may be among one of our greatest strategic advantages because organizations will increasingly compete not just on how sophisticated their AI systems are, but on whether people trust those systems enough to actually use them. So governance capacity, in my view, is not separate from innovation policy. Increasingly, it actually is innovation policy. The second and third items go together: democratic legitimacy and participatory governance. AI touches basically every part of public life now, which means that AI governance cannot be something that happens only between governments and technology companies. Citizens should see themselves within that policy process through public engagement, citizens' assemblies, deliberative dialogue, and sustained engagement with civil society and Indigenous communities and industry access across the policy life cycle. People are far more likely to accept difficult decisions about policy when they understand how those decisions were made and whose voices were included in the process. Fourth, international interoperability. Canada's future competitiveness doesn't depend on choosing between Europe and the United States. It depends on remaining interoperable with both, I think, while continuing to shape international standards. And fifth, regulatory experimentation. Sandboxes and adaptive governance mechanisms that let innovation proceed while generating evidence for future regulation. Because governance isn't a process, it is a process, it's not just a product. All this adds up to a different definition of sovereignty than I think the one we usually hear. When people say AI sovereignty, minds go straight to infrastructure like data centers, investment, domestic AI companies. But after watching Europe's experience unfold, I've come to think sovereignty is better defined by the four commitments on this slide: governing AI according to Canadian democratic values, building trusted institutions, protecting rights while enabling innovation, and shaping international norms rather than just inheriting them. So let me leave you with 3 recommendations. I think Canada needs to build governance capacity, not just legislation. It should invest in institutions alongside technical infrastructure, and it should make democratic legitimacy a competitive advantage. Europe has shown us that passing ambitious legislation is possible. It's also shown us that implementation is where governance becomes real. And Canada now has an opportunity that Europe never actually had. We get to learn from the world's first large-scale experiment in AI governance before our own system is actually fully built. Ultimately, I think the countries that lead in AI will not simply be the ones that build the fastest models or attract the largest investments, but will be the countries that build institutions capable of ensuring that those technologies will strengthen their economies, reinforce democratic values, and continue to earn the confidence of the people that they're actually meant to serve. And that's the opportunity that I think is actually in front of Canada right now, and it's well worth getting right. Thanks.
Isn't that amazing? Two fantastic presentations, and you gave us a lot to think about, a lot of content, different perspectives when it comes from Europe versus Canada and what to do next. And now we get to the hard part, talking about it. What do we do? How do we go about it? What hard questions do we ask? To start, I'm going to start with some questions to you both. So I'll ask you one the same, and then I have two tailored ones to just kick off the discussion before we go into the roundtable here. So firstly, what did you agree with each other when it comes to the presentations, and what did you disagree with?
Well,
That's not a softball.
no, it's good. Well, first off, Helen's presentation was excellent and should be standard learning for anyone interested in AI in Canada. I think I agreed with 85%, right? So, I just thought, I think I was following quite well up until the digital sovereignty definition slide.
Mm-hmm.
And then following that, it was actually a lot of the process. I actually agreed with a lot of the analysis. So just some of the conclusions maybe differently. So, so one is, I think, if I go back to the reason we were less prescriptive in our own definition of digital sovereignty was, again, we define it as freedom from coercion, which is like a very, I almost view that as like the precondition. It's like, okay, great. Like, we're free from being coerced into doing something we don't want to do. I don't think in that instance we're trying to search for the lowest common denominator and give it all up. I think we're just the way we will get to this point. And again, it's contextual, right? We are a middle power with high dependency, and we don't have a lot of leverage. And so I think that's why we chose that definition, because if we ensconce our definition in all of our aspirations, every single, perfectly expressed democratic right, and all of our goals and values, and a lot of, I would say, a lot of our projects that we do want to accomplish as a country, I think we'll get lost, and I think we'll fail. That's the honest truth. I love the Canadian project as a country. I think we should keep celebrating Canada Day while recognizing we have a lot of things to fix, but we're at a position as a country where we have to make trade-offs. And so I think that's why we took this like very base definition, because we may need to make decisions that we are uncomfortable with. And I think Canadians are bad at being uncomfortable. I actually think we're like we like to be comfortable, where it sometimes drives complacency as a country. It's kind of how we've ended up where we are. We want our data centers to be, not on anybody's property and not on anybody's right of way, and perfectly sustainable and perfectly ethical in all shapes and forms. Which is maybe why we don't control 85% of them, which is actually the same amount that are controlled by American companies. We want all of our technology to be almost perfect, and I think it's this obsession with, I think, perfection sometimes prevents us from having progress as a country, and so that's why we chose a more base definition. I would love to get closer to Helen's definition over time, but again, if I was to be in a policymaker's shoes right now, I would adopt a definition that is maybe helpful for making, let's say, 3 to 5 key investment and governance decisions that must happen in the next 5 years. And I guess that's the vantage point I'm coming at it from. And so maybe I'll just say that quick. And then the second part was, I really like Helen's example of kind of Europe as this living lab. And maybe that's something we can learn from. I'd like to give them a bit more time to experiment with that lab before we learn too much from them. And again, I've been a part of teams that have actually developed Canada's AI code of practice, as well as teams that have helped develop the EU's AI code of practice. I think brilliant people are trying to work on these governance challenges and problems. I agree with what Helen said, in that we don't really have the capacity to do so at a large scale, whether in the state or outside of the state. I think that we should not insert all of that governance power, all of that intention to build capacity into the government itself, whether that's on the regulatory side or the policy side. I think we should do things like, build up our testing and evaluation capacity in the Canadian AI Safety Institute. I think we should reform our digital governance institutions at the federal level as well as the provincial ones. But again, like, that's work that already should have been done before AI, right? Like we should have had more ability to do this as a government. We've kind of again, I showed you those numbers, the 47. We've lost that state capacity. We should get back to that as a precondition and everything else. And in the meantime, well, what can we do? Well, it's not only government that has a responsibility here. It's also civil society. It's also the private sector. I think we should demand more from those companies, but we don't just have to do that through government as a vehicle. We can do that as citizens. And so I agree with some of the comments that Helen made there. What can that look like? It's kind of demanding, third-party audits, validation. Maybe that's through legislation, but it can also just be through, again, it's an exercise of public trust. It's something, it's a discussion, conversation we have as a country. And the other part is maybe public-private or civil society partnership, which is independent verification organizations. And so, if I'm going to go and build out a big AI implementation, let's say in the city of Toronto, which they are doing, which I think is cool. Maybe there are independent organizations that I rely on, not just, hey, yeah, City of Toronto approved it and it's awesome. Maybe that can add more validity and trust to the system. And I think that is outside of the regulatory apparatus, and I think is much more flexible and actually market oriented than what Europe is pursuing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that last point. I think that's like the major idea behind that governance infrastructure slide. There's so many pillars to what it means to actually govern the technology that have nothing to do with legislation itself. It's to do with this kind of value chain model of evaluation, but then also implementation across different actors within that network. So I totally agree with that. I'm not sure I actually disagree with a lot of what you're saying, which I'm surprised by, to be honest.
That's good.
I think I'd like some clarification though about the 5 dimensions of digital sovereignty.
Yes.
That you put up there on the slide. One of the core questions up there that was jurisdictional in scope was, can you enforce your rules? Right now, I don't think we actually can enforce our rules, right? So if we're aiming for this kind of mapping of digital sovereignty per your definition, I'm wondering what mechanisms you see as being able to actually enforce those rules if they're part of the metric for the sovereignty agenda, right?
Do you want me to respond?
Yeah, sure.
So I think the answer to Helen's question is we have to be more competitive. We have to have leverage. Like we have to own more of the stack, because right now we did pass laws on digital. We passed digital streaming laws. We passed taxes. We passed regulations that largely regulate and govern American companies to more fit Canadian values, to support our cultural industries, fit our rules, whatever it is. And we backed off on them one after another. This just happened in the past year, and it happened because we are stuck in between a rock and a hard place, right? We do not have leverage as a country. And so even if we pass, let's say we pass the Europe's AI Act right now, I think we would walk most of it back. So when you mentioned jurisdictional sovereignty, are we free from coercion in the context of applying our own rules? No, we are not. And like the evidence is there in like bill after bill right now, and it's evident right now based on the discussions that are continuing to happen on a whole suite of digital policies the government's newly put forward in different areas, right? And so until we get to that point, I think and again the dimensions overlap, right? We do not have clear economic sovereignty in a digital context, which is affecting our ability to have jurisdictional sovereignty, right? Because we're under international trade pressure.
Yeah. I totally, totally. I think that's great. My question on that is, Ada, obviously you probably know it the best of anyone in this room.
I blocked it on my repressed memories.
It didn't take a value chain approach, right? And many people argued that the reason why that failed, or at least one of the reasons why that failed, is because of that lack of co-governance and value chain governance implemented into the process, but also about participatory governance generally, which I think should be part of the sovereignty conversation, and just isn't. Ada had no public consultation. Now we saw the AI task force and like the 30-day sprint, which to me wasn't actually a robust consultation by any means. So how would you kind of fit that into your idea of sovereignty and the rules-based approach, or about how to actually regulate competitively? Because I think a major lesson is that on the AI file, particularly, Canada tried to move very quickly in not having the public consultation, kind of springing Ada on to basically everyone without notice, and then had to walk it back because they actually tried to move too fast. So how would you kind of square that with this idea that like you need to have regulation by some capacity in order to gain sovereignty over that stack? But how does the process actually build to make that happen?
Okay, I'm going to respectfully correct a couple things for the record, and then and add some context, which I think is essential. So let's all zoom back. 2022, government tabled Bill C-27. which basically had a large chunky privacy component, which finally modernized our privacy laws after 20 years. Government previously failed at doing so under Bill C-11, got criticized roundly. They went back. That was initially done under, I think it was digital and data consultations, which were quite robust, 2018. There was an attachment in that bill, which was basically ended up being a separate part of the bill called the AI and Data Act. There was limited consultation done on that bill. Not technically on that portion. There was really no public consultation before it was tabled. There's two reasons for that. One, it was meant to be a very targeted bill. So the minister had met with Frances Haugen, who was the former whistleblower at Facebook. She basically said, listen, if you can do one thing, stick algorithmic transparency requirements into an upcoming bill. He said, okay, that sounds good. So we asked the department to go and do that. There was small set of roundtables with AI experts. There was an AI advisory council in Canada, including some of the top AI researchers in the country. They drafted what was meant to be I don't want to call it a skeleton, but it was meant to be a framework bill, which is saying there will be requirements that can be developed by the government. There's a statutory hinge here that can exist, but the primary motive of that bill was to create a framework to eventually develop regulations. That was the whole goal. That regulatory process then would have involved a significant period of public consultation, right? The reason that was done was because, again, in the context of AI, Canada did not want to find itself in the same problem we're in now, which is that we have 25-year-old bills, 25-year-old laws on data. It was saying, can we have a regulatory framework which is more adaptive, can move faster? Were there flaws in the process? 100%. I think I've been the first to admit that over and over again. I think what the government actually didn't do, though, was, and this is what I want to respectfully correct, was the government didn't actually walk back the bill. What actually happened was that the government doubled down and actually tried to draft a massive package of amendments that actually did bring Canada a bit closer to the EU in terms of being a lot more prescriptive, actually enshrining a lot of the same rights and similar tiers of a framework. People didn't like it. So I actually think that bill, a version of that bill would have eventually passed, but Prime Minister Trudeau was kind of forced to resign. So the bill died in the order paper. A new minister came in, said he didn't want to revisit it. I think there's a number of reasons why the minister may have made the decision. I don't want to speak for him, but for one, a lot of people's worst fears on AI in those first 2-3 years have not played it. That's the honest truth. Whether on the catastrophic risk side or on maybe more the human rights side, certainly there's been some bad things that have occurred, but none of the large scale ones that maybe either folks in the AI research community or civil society or even the private sector were concerned about. And the second is the competitive dynamic has shifted a lot quickly. Again, we don't have a strong stake here, and so I think maybe the minister sees some of the things that are maybe the writings on the wall is that bill sent a lot of people, especially in Canada, running to Silicon Valley, where they're now building technologies that we don't control. So how do we raise our control? Well, maybe we have to build more of that stuff in Canada. How do we do that? Well, can we develop things that are responsible? Can we make sure we protect our data? Can we make sure that we protect children from online harms, especially in AI chatbots? We think about the Tumblr Ridge incident, but they haven't come back with a broad-based horizontal AI bill like the EU AI Act or like what we tried before. So I think that's where we're at. Hope I covered it. Yeah.
Sorry, Alex.
No worries, no worries. I think everybody needed to hear that. They wanted to hear it. Fantastic job.
Of course.
Two quick questions. So start with Helen and I'll shift to you, Jaxson. In terms of participatory governance, like when we talk about like crafting policy, whether it be AI or whatever, what does that really look like? Like, what are the methods? And then if we look towards the AI strategy, I think a lot of people were just upset that they couldn't get their voice into it. We talked about the AI task force and then ultimately have the strategy in front of us. What does participatory governance look like in practice? Define that for us maybe, and why is it so essential?
Yeah, this is a great question. So before I answer about participatory governance broadly, I think it's important to note that, especially when we're talking about digital regulation, we often value technical expertise over lived experience. So our AI task force is dominated by computer scientists and software engineers that, of course, need to absolutely be at the table, but shouldn't necessarily dominate the way that we think about expertise in the sector, in my view. So participatory governance kind of corrects that in that it values people's lived experience in interacting with an AI technology and allows those people to engage in a governance process that forefronts their lived experience as evidence for how policy needs to address the potential harms of an AI system or its benefits potentially. So I'll give an example. over the last 8 months, Alec, you were involved. We ran a process called Gen Z AI, which was Canada's first youth consultation on artificial intelligence. We went to Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Halifax to talk to youth age 17 to 23 about AI and what they wanted for governance mechanisms in the country. We paired that with a simultaneous civic dialogue, which is basically an online version of an in-person citizens assembly process, where we could blast out policy recommendations that were drafted in a room by our 17 to 23-year-olds to about 5,000 additional 17 to 23-year-olds across the country to get their views, whether they agreed, disagreed, how they would amend those policy recommendations. You could read the report actually from Alec, might have sent it around. That process showed us that young people in particular, who are often the highest users of AI technology, are actually the ones who want governance the most badly. They're the ones calling for the safeguards because they know what it's like to actually engage with AI technologies that are disrupting their academic life, their social lives, potentially other areas of their life related to decision-making by the government and other kind of sensitive sectors. And they called for a series of 17 legislative proposals through that process that ranged from things like audit mechanisms to transparency mechanisms to, importantly, an independent regulator. And a series of those legislative calls were actually reflected in a lot of what the AI for All strategy came out with, which was great. I think that is just a testament to the fact that engaging with people on the question of AI, making it not about just technical expertise, but about the way that people are actually engaging the technologies, what they want to see from the governance, is actually a really useful way to get ahead of your concern, right, Jaxson, about like creating legislation that then doesn't actually work, and then we're back in the same position that we've always been. I think people often view participatory governance as something that slows everything down. But the evidence from that process, and also from an earlier youth assembly for social media governance that I also ran, showed that the young people who we engaged with actually wanted to, they basically drafted the exact same language that policymakers in Ottawa drafted, and that was then put on the order paper. And so increasing engagement levels, not just after the fact, where you provide someone a document and you say, here, we've come up with this policy, what do you think about it? But engaging with them from the jump and saying, okay, what do you actually care about and what values do you want embedded into the policymaking system actually makes better, more durable governance. And it, in some way, safeguards the governance process, because people, even if they disagree with the outcome, as I mentioned in my presentation, because they participated in the process, they're more likely to accept that outcome, regardless of whether or not they agree with it. So I think that's the importance of participatory governance to this AI conversation.
It speeds it up, and then we're good. Very good. And Jaxson, last one before I open it up again. We're talking about like middle powers, Canada being a little guy or a small fish in a big pond. I think that's it.
Middle fish. Yeah.
Middle fish. Let's go with that. You know, the Davos speech quoted in a million op-eds, right? Speaking about how we can unite as middle powers. How's that come into play with AI? And how do we actually do that? Is that a way for us to gain more agency when it comes to these big superpowers such as the US, China, really fighting it out and give us a voice? And then just to add on, tack on to this question, when it comes to open source, and this is really cited throughout the AI strategy recently, is this the third path? Is this the true path to maybe unite us as middle powers?
Yeah, good questions, and lots of great comments from Helen on participatory governance. So middle powers. Again, if you haven't listened to Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos, you know, is just essential listening from a rhetoric perspective. But to put, you know, real details on that rhetoric, like what does that actually take? I think we're trying to figure that out as a country. We see some inklings of this. So the Minister of AI, Minister Solomon, signed a sovereign technology alliance with Germany. Then went and acquired a German AI lab. I am curious if that parlays to Canada being kind of a key supplier for, let's say, this European-oriented alliance on AI, trusted AI. Maybe we can do that through the power of our brand, but also our tech, and having that trust. We'll see how many times that can be repeated, right? If we manage to sign agreements with, you know, other European countries, other countries in let's say in East Asia, Southeast Asia, India, right? Global South, that would be a real thing, right? And I think there's a McKinsey report saying sovereign AI as an industry could be a $600 billion opportunity. That's enormous, right? And so, I mean, if Canada got 10% of that, it's pretty big, right? I want to shoot for 20%, 25%. But I don't think we should necessarily go for bronze on this one. But again, if we are able to develop that capacity and have it be built out of Canada, that is good for governance. That is good for everything else we want to do. So I think that is one of the ways we can be useful to other middle powers and actually strengthen alliances is figure out what is that essential part that can play. Maybe it's on the model side. Again, maybe it's on the data center side. Maybe it's on some sort of fabrication eventually. So I think we have to build something in order to be valuable to other middle powers. We also have to figure out what do we need? What do we want? Like, what can we actually get? What do we want to exchange for? I believe the Prime Minister's hosting this. He wants to seek $1 trillion of investment into Canada at this Invest in Canada summit in the fall. I mean, how much of that is going to be focused on AI? I'd be very curious, right? And if so, where do we want it to go, right? Like if those investment decisions are coming up soon, like what is our mental model to do that? I think we really got to hash that out really clearly. And if how much of that is going to be sovereign versus kind of generally market available tech and things we invest in like that, that's another threshold that I think we have to figure out as a country. Second part of your question was
Open source.
Open source. Yeah, so I'll connect the middle power concept to the open source piece for a second. If you haven't read Public AI, which is a report, almost a manifesto from Mozilla, which is a great kind of open source company. Maybe if you're a millennial or older, and particularly you may have used Firefox growing up, but they do produce a lot of interesting apps and anyway, I'm a big fan of the organization. I think they've got a lot of great tech and great things they're thinking about. Public AI is, can we develop almost a public AI commons infrastructure that is useful by everyone? Open source is a part of that. I think that could be a good thing. The gap between, again, what is open source AI? It's generally available. You can download it online. You can download the weights. You can run on your own computer, run on your own infrastructure. You can see what's actually in it versus closed source proprietary. So open source, I mean, the gap between the capabilities of frontier or cutting edge AI and open source, this is from a 2026 Stanford report, has been shrinking. That gap is shrinking to maybe a few months. Some people are even saying that the latest open source models, there's one in particular, the Chinese model, GLM 5.2, that in some ways that matches Claude Mythos, which is the most powerful model in the world on some cybersecurity aspects, and maybe even on some other tasks, right? So I'm curious, does that gap close? But also, does the open stuff stay open? So there was a report from Reuters actually today saying China is reviewing their national security obligations, because again, a lot of these open source models are Chinese, saying maybe they're going to start to restrict some of that most powerful model availability. Cohere, also, again, Canadian company, just open source their most powerful model, Command A. I do not know if open source is going to end up being a third path, but I think it should be one of the things that we consider. Again, I think we have kind of three options as a country, and they're not mutually exclusive. Like maybe we want to do all these things. Like no, one is we can become essential to the AI stack. We can become more essential and have a deeper integration with the United States so that we are on a preferred partner list for the most advanced chips and the most advanced AI models. We use those where it makes sense because typically they are the best. The second is we develop domestic AI options, companies like Cohere, maybe public sector options, public infrastructure. Those are options that we can do. And the third is this whole middle powers collaboration. Maybe we have a shared model or shared infrastructure with France and the UK and other countries. And that part is the least clear, but I think it maybe has the most promise, most opportunity. We just have to figure out what do we play, what do we want. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we get into the roundtable here, just a round of applause for our amazing speaker. Those weren't really softballs, so I bet there's a question to talk about open source.
Couple knuckleballs, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, please. Okay. Okay, so let's open up this roundtable. Let's have respectful dialogue. Please put up your hand, identify your organization, your role, and send either questions at the table, speakers. Feel free to agree, disagree. Love to hear it. Go ahead.
Hi, so let me start. So hi, my name is Tabriz. I'm a corporate guy working for companies like Microsoft, eBay, and managing Asia, but I'm in Canada because of my immigration here. So my question is to both of you, either of you can attend. So I'm not focusing on anything else. I'm just looking at adoption because AI is huge. Adoption will help solve some of the problem Canada is struggling. in industry, which is productivity, and global competitiveness when we will be diversifying. So what's your thoughts on that? And what kind of policy change will require to make it faster adoption? Reason on his speed, I'm asking, because we are not known for his speed. Over to you.
Okay, all right. Canadians don't like going first for some reason. We love following. So I think the easiest thing to do is maybe throw some government incentives, or at least try and facilitate some sort of, we love government. So if government can help bring something to the table, a first mover in action, I actually think that's a very good thing to do. I think we're seeing state capitalism almost become a default, whether that's, again, China kind of has perfected a lot of this. The United States is basically doing it as well. They're taking equity stakes in companies, right? They are busting like their champions forward. I said this to someone recently who was criticizing government getting engaged with business. I said, well, why do you want us to lose? Like, I mean, if we've got two teams going at each other and the other team is getting way more money, I would say the odds of us winning are just lower. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but if I'm investing in one AI company here and you've got way more capital, I mean, it's challenging, right? And so I think our government needs to, also pick up the phone and champion Canadian companies. And again, if we get a champion, let's learn from that champion and see if there's lessons that are applicable elsewhere. We also have some sectors that are doing really well, like our financial services sector. I think it's like 50% AI adoption. So like, what are they doing that work? Our bank stocks in the country are up by like 70%. Canadians love banks. They're like all of our like top 10, biggest companies. I think 5 or 6 of them are banks. And so let's learn from what's working and make sector specific adoption playbooks. And then maybe some that are cross sector. I think like that is great. And if we can do this fast follow thing as a country, maybe we're the best new learners, right? And that's how we went. Yeah. Hope that helps.
Yeah, I might just add on to that quickly. I don't think it is a coincidence that the most adoption is in critical sectors that already have other forms of regulation. So like the banking sector, the healthcare sector, for example. AI adoption in the healthcare sector in Canada and in Toronto in particular is outstanding. And that's, in my view, partly because there are all of these safeguards that actually work in support of the technology rollout in those sectors. So I think governance plays a part in that because it bolsters the trust in people using and adopting the technology. We see that Canadians have, at this point, the highest level of engagement with AI that they've ever had, but also the lowest levels of trust in those systems. And so that's public opinion research out of the Simon Fraser University. And so we need to work on this trust question that isn't, in my view, just about literacy. It's actually about building those governance structures that show us that the government is taking care of us because we love government so much. The government should be showing us, we're making sure that what you're doing or what you're using is safe. And then I think that will help with adoption across sectors.
One other quick thing, building on one of Helen's previous points in the presentation, was she mentioned regulatory sandboxes. Again, this is like government could create a massive sandbox for many industries, including those that are not as regulated, and just say, listen, like if you're doing things under X size, let's say under a $50 million, $10 million pilot, whatever the threshold is, go for it. And we will, let's keep each other in the loop. Regulators, government officials, we meet with you regularly, but like just like start doing it, and we'll try and catch up. And I think that is a way to build trust and maybe to also help inform regulatory building at the same time. And so it can serve two purposes.
Very good. Just on the side there.
Yeah,
Yep.
so Diana English from the Center for International Governance Innovation. Thank you so much, Helen. The presentation was really, really helpful. Thinking about the EU governance structures as compared to like it's the best articulation. I feel like I could finally sink my feet into it a little bit. So thank you. Question for both of you and or anybody else in the room who has insight on this. I really appreciated the comments around what our board chair would refer to as a regulatory remote control, right, where domestic regulations are built into treaty obligations in a way that then limits domestic capacity to govern just around technologies and etc. We're in CUSMA, right? Like, July 1st is passed. We're now in the stream rule phase. Are there things you're looking at in terms of those? Are there things you're watching out for in terms of current US-Canada negotiations, particularly given the track record on some of our legislation, or like what's around the tripwires or things that you're watching for in those negotiations to help protect Canadian sovereignty?
Well, basically what I'm looking for is, do we care about digital? Because historically we haven't. We've traded for things like natural resources and access to, basically like, again, our auto industry, for example, is under a lot of pressure. Um, Digital has kind of been like, hey, that's a cool thing that we could do. It would be nice to have, but it hasn't been a need to have. And so that's really the macro question is it a need to have for our country? I would argue that it is. I wouldn't be surprised if Helen was on a similar playing field. I just think we've actually given up a lot in terms of exceptions that are available to do things. Like, even if we want to do this whole sovereign AI thing, I don't think we'd actually be allowed to without being in violation of a lot of our treaty obligations. So we'd have to figure out, how can we actually structure that so we do have at least a pocket of capability to do so. And perhaps there is a way out of dependency, and it may sound weird, but through key areas of integration, right? Like, we have an agreement with the US and saying, listen, you guys want lots of data centers for your AI companies. We'd like to help you build them. But we'd also like to build our own stuff that we control that is good for us and solely our industry, or a part of that. Maybe that's part of the agreement, right? Like, I do think there's a world in which this is a win-win situation. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum negotiation. But I would call it, without being too specific, there's a few examples in our report if you're curious, but it's exceptions around data localization, right? It's exceptions in the context of procurement. My understanding is that Department of National Defense in Canada has created some exceptions now, but again, a lot of these are under contest, right? Or by Canadian rules, by Ontario, whatever that is. And so it's a very active discussion, and I don't think there's a silver bullet. But basically, I would just say, don't give it up, because we've given up a lot already.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the government intends to
Yeah.
now, which is great. I think
Mhm.
I think that's shifted over the last few months. When we were out in Ottawa for the Gen Z AI process, we were meeting with basically everyone on the Heritage Committee and under Solomon's purview as well in the AI ministry. And the number one thing we consistently heard was that the Canadian government will not give up social media regulation, in particular, in negotiations with the US because of all of the harms that we're seeing. I'm interested to see what it looks like in kind of evolving landscape when we get back in September, what the committee study actually looks like on that file, because really that's right now our only kind of AI legislative landscape with chatbots, like the scoping in of consumer-facing Gen AI. We'll see, but they have been very open about the fact that at least that part of the digital file will remain strong, which I'm super happy about.
But can I interject for 1 second? I think that could be positive, but it's also technology from 15 years ago, right? Like, we've had social media with us for a while, and so what I'm worried about is, I guess, next 5 years is what I would say. Like, I'm talking about, like, I agree with what you're saying. I also think about, like, that is one pillar of maybe 15 that I can think of on digital, and that's what I'm worried about is, do we keep any of them that are important to us?
Yeah. Good. Just in the back.
Yeah. I'm Keith Wallace, run a digital wellness conference for high school students. I just wanted to first commend both of you on your presentations. Absolutely incredible, really, really insightful. I wanted to build on the AI adoption question there, and it comes down to high school students and teenagers. And where do you, and I'm curious if you have thoughts on this, or anyone in the room, what's your consideration around educating teens and students around using AI adoption while also having the balance of the damage that it can do with critical thinking? What is the right way to roll this out amongst youth? Because obviously they're going to be so important in being AI native and the future of Canada, while also protecting their minds.
Yeah, it's a great and very important question. I think, as we saw with the AI for all strategy, literacy is a huge part of their kind of trust metrics in the strategy. I think that's misplaced in some ways, in that we're seeing that young people are the most comfortable using AI systems, especially AI systems in the classroom, which they've been using now since COVID, basically. And so using literacy as a framing for trust and safety, I don't think is the right one. I think young people are probably the most aware of the harms, the most aware of how to use the systems, how to get around safeguards also. And so when we're talking about this balance, I think we need to actually talk about what students actually want in the classroom and also what teachers actually want in the classroom. Teachers are totally missing from the conversation on AI adoption for education. I'm actually about to start running a national consultation with teachers on this very question, because being provincial jurisdiction for education becomes a actually really important question, because all of our AI governance conversations are usually at the federal level. We totally miss this idea of the educational rollout of AI systems. And also importantly, the ways in which literacy programs are actually usually written or at least influenced in some capacity by big tech firms that are like funneling the money to our major literacy organizations to provide young people with basically knowledge about how to use the systems, not knowledge how to refuse use of the systems. And so I think to answer your question succinctly, we need to first talk to students about what they actually want, what they don't know and what they feel like they need to know. Talk to teachers about how it's impacting the way that they're teaching students, because we can't actually have a conversation about AI rollout without involving teachers and their knowledge about the differences in educational capacity now that that has been totally infiltrating the education system. And then, of course, we need to talk about provincial jurisdiction and what it means to kind of have this regulatory alignment between federal jurisdiction once we have AI regulation and provincial jurisdiction.
Fantastic. Anybody want to build off of that?
No, I had a different point, so, but.
Pia, do you want to go ahead?
Not build off. Separate point is okay.
Separate point.
All right. Well, Viet from the dais. Lovely finding meeting you in person.
Yeah.
Back forward to Jaxson. I'm going to be intentionally provocative. We're friends, and I just got off the flight. I've been awake since 5 a.m. But my reaction to what Helen you have said, right? On the point of democratic engagement and independent regulatory authority, to my mind, is attention. Partly because we think of who our current regulatory authorities are, the crown corporations, the central bank, Bank of Canada, they are not democratically accountable. But we in fact create those institutions to be able to react nimbly so as not to face those democratic consequences. The central bank can choose to decide to raise or lower interest rate as they see fit and not have to risk the job of the governor. And that's perhaps what we actually want to set up our regulatory authority for some of these digital governance as well. Right? But then in that way, that conflicts therefore with the intentional democratic integrity and democratic engagement part. And so that's a thought on, I think, what you have said in reaction to it. And then I think Jackson's sort of like portion of it, you're not off the chopping block, unfortunately. Where I think to build off what you're saying, Diana, we know that for some policy, there is a load-bearing aspect of the policy. You think about something like the carbon tax. The entirety of the consensus of carbon tax started falling down when there was a carve-out in the Atlantic for gas and heating. And it turns out the load-bearing aspect of that legislation was this idea that every single person in Canada on the consumer side was governed by the exact same rules. And the moment that essentially started falling apart, the entire consensus of that policy fell apart. In my mind, for example, the Safe Social Media Act, the load-bearing aspect of it is the digital safety plan that platforms have to submit to the potential regulator that stems all of any potential actions or obligations that arises from that digital safety plan. And so in your mind, Jaxson, I know you're going with a more minimum. The provocative place that I want to be is in these negotiations when we may have to give up some stuff. At what point would we have given up too much for it to just be kind of a fool's errand for us to not have anything at all?
Sorry, what did you mean? I'm seeking the minimum?
No, I think like the minimum standard of what, let's say, sovereignty is, understanding that in some of these trade negotiations, obligation and KUSMA, that we're not going to have the pied-à-terre, let's say, like thing, right? At what point does a skeleton just refuse to move because it doesn't have flesh?
Yeah, sure. To answer the question about the independent regulator, I don't necessarily think that the participatory nature of the governance process would have anything to do with the oversight that an independent regulator would actually have over the implementation of provisions in a bill. So I'm thinking for C34, for example, in my mind, the independent regulator serves the function in terms of its interaction with the public as like a recourse mechanism, so that people, if they feel wronged by some decision made by a social platform, have a place to go to seek that recourse. In the prior bill, we had the digital ombudsperson and the commission. The ombudsperson would have also provided resources and like other pieces of information for people to be able to engage better with the legislation and just like the general infrastructure. That's obviously missing from this, but I think the participatory piece as it relates to the regulatory function is actually just about providing people with a place to go when they feel like they need questions about a decision that was made about them, particularly as it relates to like, in the case of C34, the social media ban, potentially, the requirements about whether or not platforms will be let off the hook and be able to actually engage with 16s and under. So I think that is the participatory function. I think participatory functions change at different moments of the policy process and also different moments of governance capacity. So right now, when we're in the phase of like building potential AI governance, there's a whole different interaction with the public than there would be if there was a piece of legislation and that the public would be using it as like a resource to engage with. That answers your question.
Second part of the question, I mean, you know, if I was to think about like a minimum digital sovereignty ballast for Canada, we got to be able to build some sovereign AI infrastructure and set the rules on it. Maybe that's, let's be like very specific, maybe that's a couple data centers, right? One maybe is owned by the federal government for federal government usage, and another is shared resource for the National Research Council, or, you know, one of the AI institutes, something like that. But I remember I actually said to an American colleague one time, I said, you know, hey, let's have a slice of things, right? It's in our own country. Don't push on that. The second is, you know, we have to have options on the model side, and I think we do. Although not really on the consumer side. It's really on the enterprise side. So I'm very curious about that. Like, is there a consumer model that takes place in Canada that maybe we have some additional interaction with or governance on? Maybe that comes from middle power side. Maybe it's a Chinese model, right, that has some additional supervision. I don't know. But it seems like right now, I think the vast majority of Canadian society is probably using one of either OpenAI's ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude. So you know, maybe that's a factor that we have to consider. I think if we try and overregulate AI models themselves, we will get crushed in trade negotiations. And so I would be very careful about that. And maybe don't try and bite off more than we can chew. I think what Helen's raised around social media is very important. I think our government has to have the ability to request the moderation of content that it's actively harmful or hateful. It's complex. And I would say the last thing that I think is essential is some of the data sovereignty side. Again, like, our privacy laws are very old. I don't think we should go as far as the EU GDPR, but I think we need some minimum protections which don't currently exist, in my opinion. And you know, it's kind of a free flow use on, okay, I've given my information to you once, you can use it for all sorts of different purposes. That's probably not a good idea. And I think that the opt-outs for using your data for training, like, that probably needs to be a lot clearer. Maybe for some parts of some sensitive areas, maybe it's opt-in. Whatever those determinations need to be made, but right now it seems kind of a bit like the Wild West. I feel like I'm missing one last thing in that minimum digital sovereignty thing, but I'll think about it if I get back to you. But well, I would just say the last quick thing. So we're doing, like, where's the government's money going right now? It's going to defense and a few other key areas, right? Trade balance. That defense infrastructure, the government has articulated that we want to have, I think, 70% of that be bought in Canada. And there's also a huge discussion on things like fighter jets and things like, you know, what surveillance systems, radar systems are going to be involved. I have a feeling that is going to be less of a trade issue, but I'm not sure over time. And again, the digital infrastructure that powers that, like, we're part of Five Eyes and, you know, allied networks. And so the requirements for those to be interoperable, does that mean we have to use American hyperscaler infrastructure? Should we use it? And so how detailed that gets in the trade negotiation side, I'm curious. Good.
I do want to take one from online, and then I'll flip to you.
Yeah.
Just because we have a lot of different questions coming in and you see them piling up. One regarding AI bubbles and the AI bubble that is apparently forming. So these AI companies, don't make too much profit, and they claim there's going to be this AI bubble. What does this mean in the context of digital sovereignty in Canada, and make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, like Anthropic's run rate grew from like 9 billion to like 40 billion in like 3 or 4 months. So yeah, I think like there's money happening here, but they're also they're building vastly new powerful models that require more compute. I think we're going to see the emergence of like orchestration systems that use highly powerful models where they are needed to, and use cheaper models where it's more cost efficient. So I think costs are going to go down, revenues are going to go up. So I do think we'll get some aspect of success there. And again, we're talking about trillions of dollars of valuations, capital flowing in. So I'm not worried about like the American tech companies like failing or being early consolidated, if that makes sense. It's more just like, yeah, I mean, are we in a bubble? There are certainly bubble-like portions to it, and I think there will be some people who maybe lose out on portions of this, and there will be some failures, some acquisitions, maybe eventually. But there's clearly utility to this technology. How much that is over time will kind of remain to be seen. Like there's a lot of criticism saying, actually lots of big companies are using AI and it's actually not that useful. We'll see. Like we'll see how some of those things play out, right? I think there's also a desire for some headlines that are very critical. Me as an analyst, researcher, I personally can never imagine going back, and so I imagine there's at least hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of people who feel the same. How that becomes, a good business model over time, I don't know. And again, like what happens if the bubble pops or some aspect of the bubble pops? I mean, we've had bubbles before. We had the dot-com bubble, right? We had, but lots of fiber was laying that continues to be used. Lots of talent was developed. They will be deployed in some way. And so, bubbles popping is not necessarily bad for society, right? In some way that shortcuts privatize gain, but still results in publicly useful infrastructure and talent. So if anything, maybe that'd be healthy for the market and good for the population. Yeah.
I'm going to sort of segue back to a couple of points. So I want to say, first of all, thank you. Great presentations. My name is Christina Shea. I sit on various boards, and governance is a big piece of what I'm involved in. And I also own a PR executive AI transformation company. So really, I think going back to really to the basics where AI, it's powered by obviously data centers and energy, right? So I'm going to kind of go back in time because we talked about commercialization. To me, this is the key. This is where Canada really lies flat. And if you go back to the nuclear energy, because this is what's going to power the data centers, mark my words. So in Canada, at least. So you were having a nuclear renaissance, and now we're finally getting over the fear of nuclear because we realize we need clean energy. We have a vast, talent here. If you look back at CANDO, that was the first, I would say one of the best commercializations of talent, intellect, and, basically research that was licensed. And that was, to me, one of the successes that we should probably model. Now, also in terms of data centers, there's various academic institutions, one that I know in particular, which I can't, well, it is public. So they're thinking about putting one in Hamilton at McMaster. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And a lot of those academia, not just academia, but now it's not just energy that powers AI, it's data, right? Okay, so if data is powering AI, Canada has a vast academia, not just academia, but we have our banks, we have a lot of data, we have healthcare. I'm not sure how this could work, but if we really want to become innovative as a country, I feel like there has to be some sort of collaboration of data so we can actually power our, data or our research projects to become innovative and create, solutions that could be globally, but not just within our country. So I'm just wanting to kind of put that out as a thought.
Yeah, I can start. I think the data center question is important to me in my other work, being actually my PhD research. I work on innovation for oil and general kind of nexus between the innovation economy and the environment in Canada. And this question about data centers comes up a lot because of the environmental toll that we know data centers take. And so I always slightly cringe at the conceit that, okay, AI sovereignty in Canada requires us to create all of these data centers without acknowledgement of Indigenous land claims, environmental sovereignty, what it actually means to potentially displace hundreds of thousands of people and their access to water and clean energy, like all of this stuff, because we want a data center to be sovereign, like Canadian owned and sovereign. So I would say doesn't really answer your question, but I think we need to be a bit more critical about the data center question as it relates to AI sovereignty. I think we need to start centering Indigenous voices in our questions about data governance and about data center building. And I also think we need to talk about like the sovereignty question broadly as it relates to indigeneity because of the unique Canadian context that we're in. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'll just throw down some things to think about. So first off, we have over 300 data centers in Canada. Before AI became a thing, I didn't hear any protests or concerns about that. So just maybe a point of interest. I heard a quote from a protester down in the States that said, we don't know how to fight AI, so we're fighting data centers. I actually think that's probably pretty accurate, right? In terms of public trust situation. Data centers, I think I saw some recent reporting. There's no doubt there's some environmental costs, but I think the water use is like 1% of what we use on agriculture or advanced in industry, right? And there's a few other things above that, and so I think that's worth considering as well. We also all use them all the time. Like every single time you use Google Maps, Facebook. I mean, these are all been powered by AI machine learning for the past decade and a half, at minimum. So I think that's worth considering. Is we're certainly all a huge part of that supply chain. The third consideration there is I think nuclear is a great example of what not to do. And what I mean by that is nuclear energy is not new. It was developed over the past half century. And if people had not protested so much against it again, in the grand scheme of things, a couple of minor incidents that occurred in the mid-20th century. And I don't want to minimize them too much. But again, I'm talking about like a planet we've got billions and billions of people and tons of landmass. If we had leaned into nuclear in the same way that, let's say, France has done, we would have not had an energy crisis, an affordability crisis in the same way that we have now, and we would not probably have a climate crisis in the same way that we do now. And so, what I hope for the AI age, if this technology is actually all it is to be promised and maybe can save lives and help our environment, help our businesses, whatever, I hope we don't regulate it out of existence to the point where they can't benefit from it. And I hope we also don't overregulate Canadian infrastructure and Canadian ability as part of that. And so, if the concern is around sovereign data infrastructure, I'm actually more concerned about data centers continue to be built unabated, let's say in North America alone, without Canadian involvement. Because I think we have the best environmental record, certainly in North America, or certainly among many countries in the world. And some of the data centers being contemplated now are 100% renewable electricity powered and closed water loop systems, right? I think that's cool. And I think if we have a chance to be a big player in that, I think it'd be irresponsible not to for the world.
Okay, I'll take two more questions in the room before concluding remarks.
I just want to build off the X point from earlier. I'm sorry, I'm Christopher Hall. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Child Health Policy Accelerator. I work on online safety. Yeah, of course. Viet mentioned accountability and thinking about participatory governance and thinking about that tension. When I think about tension with the EU AI Act and the standardization process that exists there, because we have Sensen like developing standards that confer compliance to the law. Most standards bodies, ISO, IEEE, BSI, whoever, all suffer from the same problem, which is the industry are the ones that are developing those standards. They're the voices that are heard. It's a multi-layered, multi-review process that requires the capacity that only really the largest tech companies can provide, even SMEs struggle. So I just wonder your thoughts on sort of like how that tension plays out in the EU, and if there's any experiences that you've had in your participatory processes that you think could improve those processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, one of the difficulties is that harmonization between standards and and like broader regulation and legislation, that like infrastructural approach, right? I think you're totally right, and such a great point to bring up the industry engagement in standards making processes. I think in Canada it's a bit stronger. The digital governance standard, DGSI, digital governance standard, what? Yeah.
Sounds right.
I actually have sat on a few of their standards writing committees. And they do have a participatory process. So they do, it's not traditional in the sense that it's like forefronted by a participatory process and then implemented, but they basically bring a room of what they call expert drafters, and then we draft a form, like a standardization form, and then that's put out to public comment. I think the mechanism in which that public comment actually goes out is very poor. I don't think people know about it. I think a lot of what happens in questions about participation is placating. I think as long as a government or an organization can say that they have a public call, they claim to have consulted, which isn't necessarily the meaningful consultation that's needed when you're talking about participatory governance. But I think in Canada, to answer your question, it's better because at least we do have some process for public comment and standards building. And I think standards are actually a really great tool to use alongside a regulatory mechanism for enforcement. I think all of those kind of capacities, like one of my questions was in the presentation, the self-regulation, what do civil society actors do? What do academics do? What do these network of actors actually implement in a regulatory conversation is something that we need to actually pay more attention to in Canada. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Very good. I saw Mustafa's hand first.
I'm Mustafa from CSU Toronto. Thank you, Jaxson and Helen, for sharing your insights. You both spoke about the role of governments and tech companies are emerging as new middle powers or lead powers as non-state actors within the states, with actively shaping public conversations on AI and its governance. How can governments, especially in Canadian context, can balance national interests with the interest of these companies that are bringing new models every year, and how that can be balanced practically in reality?
I'm going to mostly hand this off to Helen, if that's all right. Wait, two last quick nuclear nerd tidbits to go. Government said they're going to put out 10 large-scale nuclear reactors. See if that happens. Ontario's been doing a lot here on SMRs, and again, maybe this is a way that we can export that globally, and that's good for our overall leverage. I'll just say one thing quickly, hand over to Helen. Like the heads of the major AI companies were all sitting at the G7 table. That's a photo for the ages, and that speaks to AI companies themselves acting as middle powers.
Yeah, I think the Canadian government is meant to regulate things, right? Like we drive cars, there's government regulation for how cars need to be built and safety mechanisms of cars. We trust the government to create standards that make us comfortable shopping for food and eating it, because we know that there's all these regulatory mechanisms that the government has put in place to actually make sure that what we're engaging with, what we're eating, what we're driving, all these different very important aspects of our lives are actually regulated and safe for us. That never falls in those examples on the user. So you don't have to test your own water for E. coli. The government has set standards so that we know, okay, I can open my tap and I can drink the water and it's safe. I think that's really the argument that a lot of people advocating for AI governance turn to, because we need to make sure that the systems that we're engaging with, that clearly the government wants adoption. I think a lot of people want adoption and scaling for all of the great reasons that Jaxson listed. We need to have those safeguards in order for people to feel comfortable doing that. And that involves including industry actors in conversations about how to actually govern it. I think this participatory governance approach that we started with this conversation talking about includes those actors, right? Like participation isn't just about people in their everyday lives coming to bear on regulatory questions. It's also about how those insights that people provide then get compared to, matched up with, challenged by industry actors, government actors, technical experts, this network of people who have very valuable experience and expertise who can come to the table and say, this is why this works or this is why it doesn't. And I think the government has shown that it does that type of work, particularly with industry across other sectors. And they just need to apply those same rules to AI. I think AI has become this like exceptional thing. I don't think it should be. I think, yes, it does exceptional things for productivity and economic competitiveness, but it needs to be regulated and be safe just in the way that all of our other technologies are. And I think that's the only way that Canada will actually maintain any form of competitiveness or potential AI sovereignty in this new age.
Quick addendum there. Like two things can be true. One is, AI is a normal technology. It's math, it's statistical modeling. It's just going to be built in everything that we do. Maybe it'll become more invisible over time. We'll just stop thinking about it. And maybe as Helen says, yeah, I mean, we should just treat it like everything else. But the second thing is, not everybody can go and manufacture a car or go and build an airplane, right? But now everybody's getting the ability to basically build their own chatbots, models, skills like on any computer, right? And so like the means of production are highly democratized. And so to empathize with the government for a second, like how do you do that, right? If there's this just dramatically available building capacity, it's not just, it's not a one-way street here, right? It's more like we've handed out the ability to build and launch airplanes, mini AI airplanes to everyone. So I think it is a unique regulatory challenge, and it's a unique governance challenge, and we might not be able to do the same thing that we've done before.
But doesn't that make it even more important for it to be regulated if it's in the hands of everyone, right? Like if we want to ensure that the people using the technologies are actually safe in their ability to build their own chatbots and to engage with these open source models, then I think it's the government's job to actually make sure that when they're engaging in that, when they're talking to a chatbot and building it or whatever, when they have the capacity to engage, they're actually safe.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I spent years of my life working on government regulation. I mean, listen, we 100% got to regulate things just like we do everything else, but we shouldn't regulate like everything else. I guess that's a distinction. Like, I think we do need to think about it quite differently.
And I know this could go on for so much longer. Despite the heat, I appreciate everybody's wilting. Thank you for bearing with us. It is very warm in here. Please get some drinks out of everyone. This almost takes us back to the originating question, which is, what is that balance between innovation and protection? And we kind of have to build it as we go and learn as we go. And I think it's fascinating to look and better understand the EU regulation and how we can actually, I think, take some lessons from it. But also, if we had another half an hour, I would ask, what do you think is going to happen in the EU? Or, is it going to be just this regulatory mess that gives out innovation? Are they going to find a balance? Is it going to dismantle? I'm not going to ask it now. Don't answer it because
we're ready.
I know you're ready. I know you're ready. And this is again part of a series of conversations that we are hoping to convene. Our objective here as a civic organization is to help inform and educate. We don't take a specific stance on, what decision you're going to make or what opinion you're going to walk away from. We just hope that everybody walking away from the room today and from our virtual room walks away with a bit more of an informed opinion and, understands some of the complexity of these topics a bit more and has understood perhaps a little bit, the sort of other side of the coin when people are saying, innovate, we have to, be so competitive. And then the others that are quite scared about, how do we protect our kids? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect critical thinking? And so this really is the start of an ongoing conversation. We will be holding more conversations on this specific topic, as well as other topics over the next couple of months. Our objective is to unpack quite a number of issues that we're confronting as Canadians when it comes to a variety of factors that impact democracy, the health of our democracy, our future competitiveness, trade. I mean, there's so many questions that we are well equipped to be discussing. And so please watch this space. We will also be issuing you a very brief survey after this because we do want your opinion on, has your opinion changed at all? Where do you think in terms of priorities? And what do you want to talk about next? We hope that you will join us again. Before I wrap up entirely, I am going to pass the baton over to our good friend, Dr. Bernd Al-Thusman, within the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Canada Foundation. Bernd has a great phrase, which I'm probably stealing from you now, so I hope I don't steal your thunder, but that informed citizens make good citizens. And it's an excellent truism. We really do fundamentally agree with that view. And so, over to you, and thank you for supporting us. We're happy you were able to finally join the conversation. Hopefully you were able to take part, at least in the audio, and there certainly will be a recording that will be circulated so you can catch the rest. But I will just hand it over for 2 minutes to you, Bernd, please, to close us out for the evening.
Thank you very much, Melanie, to all guests of CIC and Konrad-Adenauer Foundation to this wonderful event. It was a very interesting discussion I tried to follow. And Helen, during her speech, Helen Hayes, asked, what problems should we solve first? We should solve first my internet problem. Because shortly before I started the conference, our internet here in our office went down. We are still urgently searching on the reasons we do not know. On behalf of Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, it's my pleasure at the end to make the closing remarks of this interesting discussion. But let me say it couldn't be more important than ever to discuss as one of the main topics of AI security on Canada's and Europe's agenda to defend our democracies, to defend our children, to defend our thinking, our critical thinking against threats, but also to learn more about the chances of AI-driven environment. And therefore, this wonderful event with CIC was very important to discuss. Let me mention only one good lawyer and AI entrepreneur and writer, Yvonne Hofstetter. Maybe you have heard about her. She has written a very relevant book. She has written the book, The End of Democracy, how artificial intelligence is taking over politics and depriving us of the right decisions. There she writes about the dangers of dynamically developing digitalization, which could endanger the system as a whole. One sentence in her book at the end of this conference remains remarkable for me, maybe for you as well. And it has been going through my mind more and more often, especially in recent months and also during your conference. She said, or has written, anyone who questions the self-determination of the citizen no longer needs democracy. Although it was a fiction she has written in this published book is 10 years old. She published it in 2016. And sometimes we have some people which have visions, and sometimes this vision became reality. Therefore, it's a good advice for us to be maybe something like a firewall for democracy, and to educate as best as we can our children, and especially the informed citizen. As we often say during Kuchiching conference, the informed citizen is the best backbone and the best shield for democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenge is that democratic defense against AI-ruled governments cannot rely on censorship or heavy-handed control of information. Democracies must defend themselves while preserving the very freedoms they seek to protect. Thank you very much for joining this perfect organized conference. And again, I'm so sorry that maybe AI has hindered me. The US embassy is directly beneath customs here in Ottawa. Maybe they have heard that we want to talk about AI and the influence of maybe Microsoft and others. Thank you to Melanie. Thank you to Helen Hayes. Thank you to Jaxson Khan. We are on looking and hearing about the key takeaways, and the report at the end, we will bring it together with the next events we have together with Canadian International Council and my special friend now, here in Canada, Melanie Walker. I appreciate it very much together, also with her staff members